Coming up in this episode,
you can almost sense and feel the hatred in the air.
This is our version of live stream genocide. One of the worst things that was coming out was they were talking about these rape camps.
And actually they came back and produced a video it was on cassette in those days, called The Eyes of Bosnia. And they discovered that there were concentration camps.
Any person who is going to wage war, they need to have seen its consequence and they need to have fought.
And it was formally declared a jihad.
And he was actually in Guantanamo. So it's just strange how someone that I met suddenly, like on that list of people that we were trying to get, sort of released. And I would have probably ended up in an orange jumpsuit. And instead I was campaigning to get the people in orange jumpsuits out, and that's how Cage set up.
In this episode, I interviewed Jahangir Mohammed from the Ayaan Institute. Jahangir was one of the most vocal voices on Bosnia in the 90s here in the UK. I also spoke to Dr. Adnan Siddiqui from Cage International. I wanted to hear his story, seeing the Bosnian conflict from the UK as a young Muslim, and what prompted him to go over. Let's begin episode 3.
I am on the M6 on my way to Manchester. I remember actually going to an event in Manchester many years ago when I was young, and I heard this guy speak for the first time, and even I was thinking, as a young guy, this guy he's very solid. Yeah, so I thought this guy's amazing. Very, very solid character, very old school, very straight to the point. Very proud Muslim, and it was very inspiring. The event was called Criminalizing Islam, and that speaker is the person who I'm going to be interviewing now. So when I was obviously conducting interviews and speaking to people about Bosnia, people said to me that this guy was actually one of the most vocal voices in the country, in the United Kingdom at the time, on Bosnia, as he was part of something called the Muslim Parliament, which was an organization like a Muslim political organization which aimed to basically collect Muslim views and to represent the Muslim community here in Britain at that time. And he's none other than Jahangir Mohammed. But I'm literally on the way right now to meet him and to basically ask him and speak to him about what were things like back then, what actually happened. I heard from him on a phone call before setting up the interview that they commissioned some of the first videos to come out in Bosnia, what was actually happening in the camps and in the war. So inshallah, I hope today's interview will be a very, very fruitful one, and I'll see you guys when we get there.
So Jahangir Mohammed, I'm from the Ayaan Institute, but at the time of the Bosnia conflict I was in the Muslim Parliament of Great Britain, which had just formed in 1992 and launched with a huge global publicity around the world. It was led by Dr. Ayaan Siddiqui, very well-known political thinker and scholar, well-known amongst the Islamic movements around the world. And I was his deputy for most of the time that it existed. I think I became his deputy leader in 93. So the Bosnian conflict, for the Muslim Parliament, it shifted our focus. We were supposed to be UK focused initially, but the event was so big that we had to get involved in it. And we had a human rights committee that was very active on global issues. And in fact, we'd heard of these white Muslims an hour away from Britain, an hour flight away, which very few people knew about. But we'd heard some stories about the terrible things going on, but nobody really knew the extent of them, and the media wasn't really talking too much about them. So the Muslim Parliament, the Human Rights Committee, sent a team to investigate what was going on and to film and feed back to the Parliament. So we were like what you would call, a parliament for the Muslims. And our job was to sort of get the evidence and present it and then debate it at the Muslim Parliament sessions and come up with resolutions and recommendations, a bit like the Westminster Parliament. So we sent a team, and actually they came back and produced a video called, it was on cassette in those days, called The Eyes of Bosnia. And they discovered that there were concentration camps. So they were the first ones before even the Western media journalists started reporting it. So we basically analysed it and had a session at the Muslim Parliament where we said, look, this is going on in Bosnia, and that this was a genocide in the making, and it was more of an ongoing crusade against Islam and Muslims, because the mainstream media had essentially portrayed what was coming out, it wasn't that much at that stage in 92, as an ethnic conflict. But in fact, the Serbs and the Bosnians were all Slavs, the Muslims. So they were the same race. And many of them weren't even practicing. And they had sort of anglicised names like, Ibro and Mo and whatever. So it was the fact that their ancestors were Muslims rather than many were intermarried with Serbs and Croats. So we had a session, we passed some resolutions, I'll have to dig them out, but we basically said that this is what we think, and then we convened a world conference on Bosnia, 3-day conference, or 2-day was it, where scholars from around the world and the sort of Albania and Kosovo and all these places came, but also from Islamic movements around the world, basically analysed it, assessed it, and it was formally declared a jihad for Muslims to participate in, because there was an attempt to wipe the Muslims out. And of course, the media didn't really take that seriously. I mean, after our first session before the conference, when we reported what was going on in Bosnia, the Western journalists then picked that up and started reporting the concentration camps and investigating, and then pictures came out. So we triggered that whole thing. And then basically after the conference, we analysed it, and it was a shock really to Muslims in Britain, because these were white indigenous Muslims who'd lived in Bosnia, or a lot of them were converts initially hundreds of years ago, where they basically converted en masse. So they'd been there for 500 years, 500-year history, and obviously under the Ottomans a beautiful history and culture. So it was a shock for us to find out that there were white Muslims in Europe who'd existed, but it was even a bigger shock that they were sort of being persecuted
because they were Muslim.
They were Muslim, and that there was a genocide going on. After the Rushdie affair, a lot of anti-Muslim hate had started. And at that point, Dr. Shabir Akhtar had written an article in The Guardian saying something like, the next time there would be concentration camps in Europe, it would be the Muslims who were in them.
It's interesting to hear a UK Muslim perspective of the war at that time. Throughout the rest of the series, my focus will pretty much be that. I'll go through war accounts of Muslims from the UK who were either campaigning for Bosnia or who went abroad directly to help, either through charity or through fighting. But right now, I want to bring on Dr. Adnan Siddiqui from Cage International to share his perspectives and his stories from the war. So we'll follow a similar format. I'll switch between Jahangir and Dr. Adnan, as both stories complement each other and both of these people are gems in their own right. These are the deep insights that our generation needs to hear, so we can continue to become great and wise like the generation before us. So anyways, let's get into the next interview. Alhamdulillah, I am with Dr. Adnan Siddiqui, who is one of the directors of Cage. I've been told by many people that he's someone that I should interview. This is one of the interviews where I'm going to go straight into it. So we'll start, inshallah, by just asking, give us some of the background, particularly for Muslims here in Britain at that time. What was going on? Give us some context and some background or events that led up to you deciding to actually go there to see what happened.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Yeah, just to start and say that the project that we're discussing here, I've already sort of been made aware that there are different aspects, but there's one thing that I'd say, which we may come back to, is related to identity and some of the conversations that we've been having about, my journey. I mean, my journey started actually a lot with the Rushdie affair and satanic verses, but even prior to that, when I was at university, there was a particular thing that a lot of us used to do, which is called interrailing, where you had a month, train pass, and you could go all across Europe. And it was the first time when I went interrailing that when I went through Bosnia, that time it was Yugoslavia, that I was like a bit gobsmacked when I suddenly saw minarets, so like as we were, going on the train, and I was thinking, what's going on here? Because, everything we were taught when we were youngsters growing up in the UK is, Islam seemed to be like a very Asian, Pakistani sort of thing. That even when the, people like Muhammad Ali, the boxer, we couldn't work out saying how was it that he was black? Okay, so it was quite a strange time. A lot of people will be thinking this old geezer doesn't know anything, but that is literally what it was. Is that Pakistani and Indian sort of aspects of Islam was essentially that. There was, if you ever watched the film East is East, that was the kind of thing that it was. Everything was very Maulvi Saab, Madrasa, and all this type of thing. There was no concept that Muslims were this massive, which goes from, like I said, across the world. So when I was traveling through as a student, not particularly practicing, and sort of seeing these minarets, strange enough, there's a book called Minarets in the Mountains. That's exactly what I was like looking at, thinking, actually there are Muslims here, okay. And that got me interested in their history, and that's where it was left off, because this was Yugoslavia, this was a time of communism, and Muslims were suppressed, as were all religions. It wasn't specific to Muslims themselves. As the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then communism sort of collapsed, then all of these sort of states started to appear. And at that time there's no social media, but there's a lot of news about the former Yugoslavia. There was the first state which broke off from it was something called Slovenia. Then there was another one, Croatia, which started some war. And then there was a lot of discussion about Bosnia. Now, that's what I'm saying to you, is that my first memories. So I said that, okay, what's going to happen with Bosnia? Bosnia is majority, maybe just Muslim. But the worst thing about this time, like I said, now you're seeing live stream genocide. This was our version of live stream genocide, because you'd see, sort of like pictures of concentration camps, and in fact one of the worst things that was coming out was they were talking about these rape camps that were sort of there. And I was a young doctor at that time, and
what time period are we talking?
This was 91, 92, towards the end of it, because this is a time that like I was like getting more and more kind of horrified by these images that were coming through. And like I said to you, is that it wasn't like the 24-hour news cycle that you've got here at this time, that you'll get snippets of news, because like I said to my sons, is that our news was that the actual TV would go off at 12 o'clock. There was no such thing as a 24/7 news cycle. These images were quite shocking, and actually very similar to what we're seeing now with Gaza. Is it was something that affected everybody, like any person of conscience was seeing. There's one very particular sort of image of a Bosnian in a concentration camp who was behind a barbed wire, and it looked very much like a kind of almost like kind of an Auschwitz type of picture, where you can see his ribs, he's literally skeletal, okay. And this was something that like I said, became one of these iconic images. And when you hear about the rape camps and everything like this, I thought, this is just like crazy. And I think the big wake-up call for me was that, going back to the time where we always thought that, we as Muslims in the UK, it was a Pakistani Indian thing and we were guests here. When I looked at the fact that these are indigenous Europeans with, blonde hair, blue eyes, and there was no mercy on them, you know. Because like for us, our parents always used to say to us, is that you're guests here and you need to have an exit plan to leave this country, which, you know, we would sort of laugh that off and just think, no, it's fine. I mean, there's a lot of racism at the time that we grew up, but we never really felt that, you know, we would go back. I mean, like, we used to go back regularly back to Pakistan, and, you know, I was neither here nor there. It's you know, like I go to Pakistan as a foreigner, and over here I'm a foreigner. So the thing is that there was really no kind of option there. It's thinking, okay, that's viable. But the whole thing about Bosnia, which was the shock for me, was that if indigenous Europeans were being actually targeted for their faith, then that was something I had to process. And okay, maybe along the lines I've had to sort of think that through, and how my identity and how my sort of journey has changed. But really at the end of the day is that I did feel that I needed to do something, you know, thinking back to that time of, you know, the Bosnians I'd met who at that time were Yugoslavs and had no real kinds of thing that, you know, they used to greet, you know, me, you know, like sort of saying salam and everything like this, but it was you could just still see, even though they were like under a communist dictatorship, they still had that connection, you know. And I thought, if they were as practicing as I was, which was not particularly, okay, and they were being targeted, then I thought there's no, we really have to sort of work out that what is our place, you know, in Europe, what is our relationship to these Bosnian Muslims, you know, like, because they're literally, as I'd already seen, is they were a train ride away, you know, from London to Sarajevo. It was not difficult. And like in my sort of, you know, my first journey out there, is you can be in, you know, sort of the former Yugoslavia. It can be a 36-hour journey if you don't stop, just literally by road. So it's not like some place, you know, far away. But that was, like I said, the, you know, like I say, the mindset that got me to going out there. And the thing that really triggered, I suppose, me saying I need to go were two very different events. One was, there's a conference at LSE, I think it was organized by HISB, called the Bosnia Conference, and one of the main speakers was a person who we consider to be one of the best speakers of their time, maybe of, you know, of perpetuity. He's really an amazing speaker, mashallah, was Umar Bakri Muhammad. And he gave a speech which I don't know if anyone, you know, has any kind of heart, they would have just got up and gone, because he was amazing, that how he inspired people and everything like that. And that's exactly what happened, is that after hearing him talk, you know, I just said, okay, you know, I have a particular skill, I'm a doctor. You know, I did start to do some research to say, okay, do I need to join all of these kind of, you know, Doctors Without Borders and all these type of things. And I think, you know, the same quandary that, you know, youngsters have got now, which is that at that time they said, well, you haven't got any experience, you know, and well, you can't get experience if you don't actually get the job. So this was the thing that I thought, I said, okay, so what do I do? So then I went to Muslim organization like Islamic Relief, you know, Muslim Aid. There were only two at that time. That was literally the only two organizations. Now there's, subhanAllah, God knows how many, you know, sort of charities out there. But they had no ability or, you know, inclination to take this, you know, like I said, young doctor who wanted to go out and do anything. And the bit that made me suddenly, you know, they also closed the door on me. They said, no, there's nothing we can really help you out. We'll just give you money and we'll distribute it, which I felt was not that useful. I felt that, you know, I've got more to offer. And then I was listening to, I mean, it's still around, you know, there's a radio station, Radio 1, that I was listening to that, and I heard of a doctor, I still remember his name, Zia Alvi, who's a doctor, and he took out a mobile clinic to Bosnia. And, you know, I still remember this was like kind of autumn time coming to winter. And I thought, okay, if he can do that, and I can do that too. So there's no reason. Now, obviously, I've got no idea. I was a junior doctor at that point. You know, he seemed to be a bit more senior. At that time, there was no WhatsApps. There were, mobile phones were non-existent and everything like this. So there wasn't like I could just like say, okay, let's try and search him out and find out what he's up to. But I just thought, okay, fine. You know what? I'm going to go out there and do something. And I'd made some contacts at that LSE conference, and I sort of rang somebody up, and strange enough, he was literally lived, it's like 2-3 miles away from me. And I just said that, well, look, I'm really interested in going. He said, oh, okay, if you're interested in coming, we've got a convoy coming out in the next couple of weeks. Then, he came back to me sort of like in the new year, I think that was 92, and just said to me that, okay, what's your plan? And I said, well, actually, yeah, I haven't applied for anything. I was just really hoping that, the convoy thing was still on. And he said, yeah, inshallah, we're going out, can't remember when it was exactly, but it was some point in February. My parents I told them, I said, look, I'm planning to go out there. And my mom, like all mothers, said, no, you aren't, and I said, well, inshallah, you make dua, I'll make dua, and let's see what happens. And she was very convinced that there's no way I'd be able to. And next thing this brother, may Allah have mercy on his soul, he's passed away, but didn't pass away in Bosnia, he passed away in Pakistan actually. But he came to my house, spoke to my mom and everything like that, as a usual sort of thing there. Desi mums need to be persuaded by sort of thing. And he was not my elder, that's the thing, but because he had a big beard, then that sort of like made my mum think, okay, maybe he's a nice boy, and he'll go out and tabligh and all this kinds of thing there. But like the end of the day is that he was the one who sort of said to my mum, he said, no, don't worry, auntie, he'll be fine, this, that and the other. Showed us some pictures of like the trips he'd made and all this kinds of business. And she reluctantly said, okay, fine, and yeah, that was my first trip in 92. A real eye-opener. I mean, like I said to you, is that the first trip that I made out there, it's actually, we stayed in a refugee camp in Zagreb, which was the capital of Croatia. And then after that, we then, sort of like went from Zagreb to, there's a coastal town in Croatia called Split, which beautiful place actually. Like if you go, you'll see it as a holiday destination, everything like this. Again, same thing is we stayed in the refugee camp and everything like this.
So it's a big shock for the Muslims. If this can happen to them, well, we're brown Muslims, and what can happen to us? So I think the extent of the hostility in Europe to Islam and Muslims came out, and that really affected the Muslim community. And basically, because there was a UN arms embargo, it only affected the Muslims. So it was a very devious move by the European and international institutions, because
It sounds strange, isn't it?
yeah, because when Yugoslavia collapsed, the arms ended up with the Serbs and the Croats, and the Muslims, who were not really in power, although they were all trained soldiers. They'd all had to be called up and trained in the army. They had no arms to fight with, so they could fight, but they had no weapons. Obviously, people were already starting to send aid, but what they really wanted was either weapons or and the Muslim community to call for lifting of the arms embargo. And we assisted the Bosnian Muslims whilst everybody else was doing aid. We did other stuff. So we actually, the Muslim Parliament actually had a Arms for Bosnia fund.
Okay.
As provocative, and the British Parliament then basically made it illegal, I think it might be in Hansard somewhere, to collect funds for an Arms for Bosnia fund. So we then renamed it Jihad Fund. And basically, we did collect lots of money, and we did assist the Bosnian government in a number of ways. One was we bought, with that money that was for the Jihad Fund, and in those days it was possible, we bought them things that you still needed to fight with. in a war, but not the embargoed weapons. So we asked them, what do you want? And they said, well, in the winter, we can't fight without boots. So we arranged for a consignment of boots to help them. And then obviously Dr. Khalim Siddiqui, with his international links, arranged for, encouraged Muslim countries to provide the weapons they needed. And many of them did, primarily the Iranians. The Iranians were the biggest suppliers of weapons to the Bosnian Muslims. And the Bosnian government recognized that. But yeah, they survived, or they had a very tough time. They were on the brink of sort of being eliminated. They did have a genocide, but I guess what helped them to survive was those weapons, but also the fact that they were already trained soldiers, so they knew how to fight. And then they were very articulate as well. And the other thing we did, and specifically myself and the Parliament here, is we were on media a lot, and we challenged this whole notion that it was an ethnic conflict and said it was a war against Muslims and Islam, and basically also criticised the Western government, particularly the British government, which was playing a very duplicitous game, which,
as they do,
which they were really supporting the Serbs, and they were just manoeuvring their diplomacy just to give the Serbs time to do what they needed to do. And we said at the time in our political analysis that the whole aim of not doing or not intervening to stop it was because they didn't want a Muslim state in the heart of Europe. And that's
looking at it. That's what it's.
Well, if you now read Douglas Hurd's biographies and a few others, and I think Clinton may have said this as well, that's what they say in their diaries, in their biography. So our analysis was proven correct. So we did political analysis, we highlighted what was going on, we campaigned for the right things, what the Bosnian government wanted from us, and we mobilised the Muslim community around that. A lot happened, probably lots of things I can't remember, but it was a painful lesson for the Muslim community, because effectively it was the first genocide in Europe after the Holocaust, Jewish Holocaust. And it was Muslims, and it was white Muslims as well, who were exactly like the Europeans. And we were brown Asian Muslims sitting here looking at what's our fate. Even if we're here 500 years, is this going to be our fate? So it had a very deep psychological impact on the Muslims, and we never really knew they existed as a community. And of course now we know there are Muslims in Kosovo, in Albania, in other places in Europe, and there's a whole history that we're unaware of. And they didn't intervene. We had Srebrenica, where they turned a blind eye and people were massacred.
We were just literally coming off on a van which we'd taken from Walthamstow down to these places, and we stayed with the Bosnian refugees, and why it was so eye-opening was that there were people there from all walks of life who had literally just had to get up and leave because their neighbors had turned on them. The Serbs were very clear that they wanted them ethnically cleansed. We see this term used very frequently now, and actually if you look at how Israel behaves, they've been very clear in terms of the same rhetoric that the Serbs and Croats used at that time. It's the same rhetoric that the Israelis use, to put facts on the ground, as they like to sort of say there. So that was, like I said, when you see these events all these years later, it's the same cycle repeating again and again. It's the same, lines being used by the same people, and I think it's valuable for us that if you don't learn from history, you're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes. And I think this is why this project is important, because it's literally, what I hope for is that the mistakes and the things that we learn from, that people from your generation and others can sort of basically make sure that you're wise to it and you're not going to be kind of caught out, because that's what the hadith says, is that you don't get bitten from the same hole twice. So I think from my perspective, I think it's a good project, and inshallah, may Allah bless it.
But the Russians were supplying arms to the Serbs. The Orthodox Church were blessing the Serb activities. There was a lot of horrors. I think tens of thousands, some estimates 50,000 women were rape camps. It's a horror. I mean, like we're seeing now in Gaza, but that was the first horror. When I went in the mid-90s, I'd never seen anything like it. The thing that sticks to my memory is you can almost sense and feel the hatred in the air. And when my driver took me round, I'd see all these villages, Muslim villages, were empty, and all the mosques were demolished, and the churches were still standing. So I was thinking about it. I used to reflect on this. Look, even when they were being massacred, the Muslims didn't destroy the churches when they left. And yet all those mosques and everything was really destroyed. It was school fields were full of graveyards or gravestones. I remember I came out of Sarajevo Mosque after Friday prayers, and an old Serb man, he looked at me, came up to me, and he couldn't speak English, and he summed it up very beautifully. He looked at me. He had his beret on. He looked like a French guy, actually. And he realised I was foreign. And he said, Serb, Croat, Din, Dushman. And those are the only words he said. And he summed it up in that sentence, that these people are fighting us, or enemies of our faith. And that's what they're fighting us for. But yeah, there was a lot of beauty. I saw the Mostar Bridge. I've got photos as well of that I took personally. The library that they destroyed, they set it on fire deliberately to burn all the records of the land records of the Muslims, all the Waqf. So I have a photo of that destroyed. Mostar Bridge, which was beautiful. Got a photo of myself with Ayub Ganic and with Mustafa Cheric. I remember going to Sarajevo University, and it's weird. All this university was blown, the windows were blown out. And I sat there in this building with this one professor, and he was telling me he was documenting the war crimes. That was the first attempt. And he'd written this book, and he was telling me almost in tears that no Muslims would fund his work. And it was the Catholics in the Philippines who funded this particular work. So he gave me a copy of the book that he'd done, and he was on the second book, which was documenting war crimes. But that's important. The Bosnian mentality is very important. They made an effort to record the war crimes and keep records, so one day they could bring these people to justice. And I think I made a commitment then, which sort of informs my activism. Is when I saw all that, I realised that actually this has got nothing to do with racism. Nations can fall to pieces anytime. Hate could be spread anytime. In fact, 3-4 years before the Bosnia, when we had these conference and specialists came, they were telling us about the whole atmosphere that was created in the media with Muslims as enemies, much like you see here now. And that's actually what created the hatred that led to the genocide, as well as war propaganda and people fighting for territory. So I made a commitment to, basically say, look, as a Muslim, this is your twos. And when I speak, and maybe you might have heard me speak sometimes, and people who see my writing, that every Muslim should be brought up with the knowledge that that hatred is part of their heritage and destiny, and they should always be prepared for it. Because if you're not, some people say, "Oh no, if you get on with everybody," which we have to, and you have community cohesion and you build these communities, then it'll all be fine. But history teaches us that even like in the case of the Bosnian Muslims, where I think something like 50-60% had intermarriage, that the moment can turn any time. And now if you look at our work on India, I take a very particular interest in Hindutva ideology and what's happening in India. We were all neighbours. Those people coexisted for a long time. And what do you see now in India? 200 million Muslims. So we have to be a community that's prepared. It will affect future generations, so we have to resist and counter that propaganda and hate.
I was there for a few months, sort of came back, and at that time, obviously, I just thought, okay, this is something which is long term, that I need to be invested in. And, so a lot of the work that I was doing after that was related to getting in and relief and everything like that. There were brothers who I was with in Split who were just waiting there to enter, because essentially that, those people who went there to fight, they would need to sort of like look at the timing and things like this, and they'd all have to sort of go clean shaven, and suddenly like the next bus in would sort of bring them in. My thing was all related to relief work, and so eventually when I did get in there, I can't remember when, but I was, if you want to look at it, legitimately there as a relief worker. And there were people going back and forth, but it was not easy, because in fact our main enemies, I'd say, that when we were going into Bosnia were the Herzegovina Croats rather than the Serbs. The Serbs was just like another thing. That was a purely military thing. But for those of us who were aid workers and any person who was going in there, it was the people who were causing the difficulties were the HVO militia, which was the Croat militia. They were almost laughed at. If you looked at that in terms of an enemy that was, actually was, you had some respect for. The Serbs were the people that you really sort of felt, okay, they could fight. They knew what was happening. The Croats were, like I said, they were too interested in wearing their Ray-Bans and looking cool. So, but like I said, maybe I'm being cruel there and being a bit sort of thing. But yeah, it's going back to that sort of thing. They're going into Bosnia. It was, yeah. I mean, there are sort of a lot of things that I felt quite pained about. They were really. This was not, like, war is an ugly business, and I think that one of the things I'll always, say to people is that, any person a politician or any person who is going to wage war, they need to have seen its consequence and they need to have fought. I don't believe in these career politicians who, they sort of say, yeah, our brave boys are going out to fight. Until you actually see what reality of what, war does, I'm not interested in any leadership who's not been out and fought or has actually been there on the front lines, not with some kind of photo opportunity and everything like that. Because if you're going to send people into fight, you need to know what those consequences are, because it's not a pretty business, okay? And it's something that you need to understand that what you are actually doing. Obviously, as Muslims, there is a mandatory aspect of our deen which is related to whether it's self-defense or offense, it doesn't matter. But the whole point is that, from that perspective, you can't have people, and I even think that, people, you're talking about the ulama, if they're going to make discussions related to jihad or to politics, these people have to have been out there to see it. You don't want armchair academics. That's what I'm saying to you. I think one of the problems that you get is that, say the question you asked about how come there were, Muslims, sort of in Zagreb. Politics, warfare, all these type of things, there are alliances, there are temporary things that, you have to sort of deal with, treaties. There is definitely that much abused term in fiqh of maslaha. You know, I would rather people who have been there and have actually understood those realities and actually are sincere, rather than people who just like, oh well, you know, they'll sort of sit in conferences and say that, okay, this is what I think we need to be doing. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of stories. So thinking back through it, there are too many that I could just like sort of, you know, I can't even pinpoint to any particular thing. But all I'd say to it, it's the Bosnian experience for me was, you know, what has helped me, you know, and allowed my trajectory sort of like from, you know, where we are. Because after that, I was very involved in training doctors to do relief work and also trauma training, because, you know, when you're dealing with sort of you know, people, you know, who may be not just, you know, victims of war but also sort of soldiers, is how do you sort of help them and how do you deal with that type of thing. So there's a lot of stuff that I was involved with after that, you know, that I was doing. Then, you know, I went to Kosovo and Albania after this, tried to go to Chechnya after that, and my final sort of work was actually in Afghanistan, because you know, there was a lot of experience that I'd sort of gained, you know. So after those early days when people said you haven't got experience, in fact the strange thing is that after, you know, 9/11, the people who got in contact with me a few years later was the British Army, because they said that we actually want you to work with us. And I was quite entertained by that idea, that thinking that, okay, they've profiled and looked at everything and thought, okay, this guy could actually be very useful to us. But I said thanks, but no thanks, and that was where that ended up. But yeah, I'm sorry that I know it might be a bit of a ramble, but there are too many things I could be talking about, and I can't think of anything specific. It is like I said to you, my final work related to relief work, because I was involved in setting up an organization called Doctors Without Borders, which was like a Muslim version of Doctors Worldwide. Sorry, Doctors Without Borders is the MSF, which is the you know, the secular organization. But we set up Doctors Worldwide, which was, I think, in '97, if I'm correct. But it was people who had all done relief work and tried to get together to sort of say, okay, you know, we have all of the affinity, cultural affinity, religious affinity, language skills. You know, why would we not be the people who should be foremost in this work, rather than, you know, non-Muslims who don't share the same culture, language, you know, any of the things there. So for us it was an opportunity to do that. But my last work with Doctors Worldwide was in 2003, and the primary reason why I stopped that was because, you know, I was in Afghanistan in 2001 in August, and as is like I've sort of mentioned in some of the commentaries that we've sort of done, is that Allah was the protector, because I don't know how it was that I managed to leave, and it wasn't by any kind of design. It was just like, you know, come back to sort of say, okay, this is a project, and then 9/11 happened, and rest, as they say, is history, because I could have very easily been a relief worker in Afghanistan, and I would have probably ended up in an orange jumpsuit, and instead I was campaigning to get the people in orange jumpsuits out. And that's how Cage set up, is you know, from what I consider to be well, I shouldn't say it is a qadr of Allah, because, you know, you might say it was a lucky escape, but there's no such thing as luck. Allah has decreed things to happen, and either I could have just said, okay, I'll just keep my head down and be quiet about it, or that Allah has allowed this opportunity for a particular reason, and the people that I knew in that time period who suddenly had disappeared, you know, they needed to be, I think, their voices heard. In fact, I still remember one of the people, you know, that when we started the work of Cage, at that time as Cage Prisoners, it was actually a brother who was the head of Kuwaiti relief, who I met in Zagreb, and he was actually in Guantanamo. So it's just strange how, you know, all those years later, someone that I met all those years ago was then suddenly, you know, like on that list of people that we were trying to get, sort of released. And alhamdulillah, he has been released. So that's what I'm saying to you, is that I think that, Allah throws opportunities your way, and we just have to recognize them and see what we need to do. And one of the things I would definitely say in the story that I'd bring up here is that you may feel very, very helpless, because this is what I certainly felt when I saw the first images, related to Bosnia, and the doors which are closing on my face from non-Muslim relief agencies and Muslim relief agencies. But if the expression is, where there's a will, there's a way, and if Allah decrees it, nothing can stop you. So alhamdulillah.
The biggest impact was when the pictures started coming out of the camps, and you saw these emaciated Bosnian Muslim men, and then you see all these refugees running away, pictures of refugees in carts leaving, and the stories that people tell you about women who were raped, people putting women who were pregnant, basically they were deliberately making them pregnant for them to have served babies, and they would put, when they're killing the Muslims, they would put crosses on them, and real horror stories, and a lot of them you don't hear of in the war crimes tribunals, but it was driven by faith and a hatred of a faith. Even the fact that they weren't even practicing Muslims, it would be, they might not have even had names, but they were basically, their ancestors were Muslims. There's lots of stories. Obviously, people who went there to fight will tell you stories. We did have some Bosnian Muslims come here. We weren't given access to them. I wrote to the Home Office saying, where are they? So the government's policy was not to put the refugees who came in with Muslims. They put them with Christians. So we couldn't have access to them. So we tried. I think I might have the letter somewhere I wrote to the Home Office. So they kept them away from Muslim communities so they didn't become integrated, and they remained sort of less integrated in Muslim communities.
The bad aspects of it is just how war affects people, young people, elders. The key is this, from my perspective, definitely having seen that, is that young men, particularly Muslim men, need to be able to fight. There isn't any question about it. This is part of I would say the aspects of manhood that should be there, that this is something which, if we're not in a position to defend not just ourselves but our families, then at some point it's going to come back to bite you. So this is something I would always be sort of saying, it needs to happen, because you can't tell when things are happening. It was very sad seeing situations where in refugee camps you have people who literally thought everything was fine. The same way we are looking at the bright lights of the big city and thinking everything's cool and we can go and have our, sort of mountain burgers and blah blah and all these kinds of things there. But things can change in an instant, okay? And one of the things I will always say, that going back to sort of history, in fact it was something that was said to me by an imam who was doing the nikah for one of my good friends, who was marrying a Turkish sister, and he sort of said, always have an exit plan, because the Europeans have a nasty history of going all genocidal and pogromish in the way that they deal with outsiders. And this is a lesson to say that the Bosnians were not outsiders, but this is what happened. Their own neighbors turned on them, okay? People that they married into. The religion was not like some kind of thing that you never married a Serb or a Croat. Even now, actually, Bosnians, or some Bosnians, they sort of keep talking about how liberal they are, but liberalism never saved them. Communism never saved them. Just the hint that they may be this horrible term, but it's become like a catchphrase now in inverted commas Islamist is enough to convict you and affect you. And it's something which, I was speaking earlier with the project manager of this, and my background is that I'm from sort of a muhajir, meaning a background which is leaving from India, Muslims from India, and our family who's left in India, despite all of the compromises that you have to make, you can see that with the BJP and the Hindutva government that's in there, it's never enough until you're actually worshipping idols, and even then they will never accept the fact that you may not be trying to deceive them. So I think that going back to this issue of wherever it is, Islam is something that we need to be proud of. We need to be, it's a blessing that Allah has given us, and it's the only thing that gives us dignity as human beings, and to be the Khalifa on the earth that Allah has destined for us to be. But that is a heavy responsibility, and like I said, part of that is that you need to be just, you need to be merciful, but you also have to be, when it comes down to enemies, you need to be able to fight. But people should be you should be very respectful, but don't let people treat you as fools and to be soft touches. And I think that is part of something that we've learned. We've learned that over the past several decades, is that peace conferences and things like this they're of no use unless you have something to back up what you have, and that's the important thing, is that whether it's as a nation or whether it's as individuals, you need to be ready to fight. Sadly, having gone back to Bosnia more for sort of just seeing how it is, and as my sort of family wanted to see where this country is that I went to in my youth, is that they are not silly enough to be taken in by, and they are prepared to be dealing with any eventuality. Like I said to you, is that I was shocked by the HVO, the Croat militia flags when we were in Herzegovina, but also just literally you turn a few streets outside Sarajevo, and we were in a resort which probably was one of the places where the butcher of Sarajevo, Ratko Mladic, would probably be observing the Sarajevo skyline, and we were actually in the Republic of Srpska, which is the sort of state that the Bosnian Serbs have sort of produced. So, like I said to you, is that it's something that we need to be well aware of, is that we're living in a difficult world, and certainly what we've seen right now is that there is no such as an international world order. It's falling apart as we see it in front of us. Anyone with an ounce of sense should be able to sort of see that things like the Security Council and other old post-World War II structures, they are now outdated and of no use whatsoever. They are simply things which are relics of the past, and they need to be consigned to history. What we have to, as Muslims, be able to do, and those are the lessons of Bosnia, but also all the conflicts we've seen from that time onwards, is we need to be prepared. It's something that you will only be respected if they realize that there is a likelihood that you are going to resist and you will fight back. So like I said to you, as much as we like to, or there are many of our Muslim brothers and sisters who like to come out with the mantra of Islam is peace, I say yes it is, but don't engage us in war, because we will also resist to the end.
In terms of the next generation, why is a story like Bosnia important to remember, or to even bother reading about or understanding what actually happened?
I think it's important because we have to draw the lessons. There's lots of lessons, but as I say, the first lesson is that you could be living a wonderful life, you could be perfectly integrated, but events happen, countries break apart, economies collapse. So as a minority, you can become a target anytime. Secondly, you have to be organised politically. There's no point in being just humanitarian organisations. And part of the success of that Bosnia was there was something like the Muslim Parliament that was politically organised, that was politically on the ball, putting the case that this was not an ethnic genocide and arguing and making those links internationally with different groups and movements and recognise you're part of a global ummah, which there's nothing wrong with that. Other communities, Christians, Jews, Hindus, they all do that. So we have to not be ashamed or afraid of having those global connections. And we have to create the sort of political institutions and the other institutions needed, the media, to combat that prejudice and hate, and to be prepared, but also not to rely on governments to do our elected representatives to be our voice, and to sort of continuously organise outside and push them to do the right thing, because we know, and we're seeing it now with Gaza, they've done nothing, they don't care.
But isn't that like part of the lesson, that the politics of pushing these so-called elected representatives, haven't we come to a point where we need to do something beyond that now?
Yeah, well, as I say, we did that with the Bosnia thing. The Muslim Parliament convened a global Bosnia and the Global Islamic Movement Conference, where global countries and movements came together, and we made it a issue, and that's where a lot of the successes or interventions, as much as we could do, were made. But we have to be aware of that game, that if you get in political parties, they are the solution, and in fact they're not, as we've seen recently with Keir Starmer's statement on Lebanon.
Yeah.
You know, before the election, Muslim MPs were telling us, no, things are going to change. You know, his policies will change. If we stay in there, we'll change. That's not how it works. And we have to become more united. Bring these countries together and tell them to focus on these issues, and not rely on the Western institutions, the international order. We've been there before. We have to do things ourselves, even if that means, documenting the war crimes, bringing people to justice ourselves as a community. Lots and lots of lessons, really. But I think what's happened is because there's been a focus on people integrating into the political parties and seeing them as a solution since Bosnia and since Iraq war, I think we've actually disempowered Muslims. And then all the legislation that's come in force means that the things that the Muslim Parliament did then are probably not going to be allowed now. But, it's important still for us to be politically vocal, not be afraid to talk about the right issues and the moral issues, because history has recorded that the approach and the politics of the Muslim Parliament, the analysis and the things we did, were the right and moral things to do.
I must say, I learned a lot from speaking to Jahangir Mohammed and Dr. Adnan Siddiqui. And me being me, continuing the conversation after the recording has stopped, I had 100 different questions for them. I'd like to thank them and every single guest that has given their time to speak to me. I hope you benefited from these insights and the stories, and I hope you've enjoyed this journey so far. So, I'll see you in the next episode, where I speak to my uncle, who actually went from the UK to Bosnia, and we'll discuss some of the stories about the war, along with the story of Muazzam Beg.